Hi kids, it's time for The Bible and You. And today's episode is, I hope you found the last 18 episodes useful, and I'm really happy to see you again in episode 19. And in episode 19, we're going to look through the book of Hebrews chapter 7. So in the past two episodes, we've been looking at that portion of the book of Hebrews where the author compares Jesus to the Old Testament priesthood. And the author is slowly trying to show us that Jesus' priesthood is superior to the Levitical priesthood. So chapter 7 is like the final chapter where the author brings everything together and he explains what kind of priesthood Jesus follows. And if you want more information, so in this episode I'll be going through whatever the author mentions in chapter 7. But if you want more information on Aaronic priesthood and Jesus' priesthood, there are two episodes which we've already done on these two topics, and you can refer to those episodes for more information. So for today's episode, chapter 7 can be divided into two parts. In the first half of chapter 7, the author explains who the character of Melchizedek is. He introduces the character, he explains what we know about him, and he also explains how he is greater than the Levites and he is greater than Abraham, and therefore he is a greater priest than the Levitical priests. And then in the second half of this chapter, the author explains that Jesus is just like Melchizedek, and then he offers some comparisons of what similarities they have. And then he concludes the chapter by saying that because of these reasons, Jesus is greater than the Old Testament priests, or his priesthood is superior to the Old Testament Levitical priesthood. So let's go through what the author tells us about this character Melchizedek, which is explained in the first few verses. So I'll just go through this point by point. So this is what we know about the character of Melchizedek. First of all, we know that he is the king of Salem. Secondly, we know that he is a priest of the Most High God. Then we know that Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And then we also know that Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything that he won in the war. And we're told that Melchizedek's name means king of goodness, and because he is the king of Salem, that can also be translated to mean king of peace. And this is everything we know about the character of Melchizedek. The author goes on to say that there is no genealogy recorded for the character of Melchizedek. Nobody knows when he was born, nobody knows when he died. We don't know who his parents are, we don't know his origins, we don't know where he came from. We don't know any of this information. But usually if you read through the book of Genesis, or pretty much any important character in the Bible, most of the time the Bible gives you a clear record of who they are. But for some people it's not given, and it is intentionally left out. So Melchizedek is one of those characters. It doesn't mean that he never died. It doesn't mean that he was born with no parents. It just means that even though those things happened, they're not recorded in the Bible for a particular reason. If you want to know more about Melchizedek, you can refer to the episode where we talk about Jesus' priesthood. So the author refers back to the fact that Abraham gave a tenth of everything that he had to this Melchizedek. And then he explains out of the law, which the Israelites or the Jewish believers are very familiar with. He refers back to the law and he says, in the law it says that everybody should give a tenth of what they have to the priests, to the Levitical priests, right? To the priests in the temple of God. So this is given in the book of Leviticus, where God explains the tithing system of how people need to give a tenth of everything they have to God, to the priests in the temple. So he says that that's how the system works. That's how the law explains that things should work. But here we see Abraham giving a tenth of everything to Melchizedek. And if you think about it, Levi, or the Levitical priests, are descendants of Abraham. So in a way, the Levitical priest or Levi is giving a tenth of everything he has to Melchizedek. So we see here that Melchizedek received a tenth of everything as a priest, even though he was not from the tribe of Levi. He was not a descendant of Abraham, he was not a descendant of Levi, he was not a descendant of Aaron, and yet he received tithe from Abraham himself. Then from there on, the author explains that Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And usually it's the greater person who blesses the lesser person, right? So usually the parents bless the children, the grandparents bless their grandchildren. It's usually the person who is greater who blesses the lesser person. And in this case, we see that Melchizedek is blessing Abraham, which means that Melchizedek is greater than Abraham as well. So through this, the author is making two important points here. The first point is that Melchizedek is greater than Levi, the Levitical priest, and the second one is that he's also greater than Abraham. So the author explains that in the Old Testament times, the people were given the law to explain or to understand how the system of priests worked. So the law of Moses told them that a priest had to be a Levite. The law of Moses told them that Aaron was the high priest. The law of Moses told them that when the high priest dies, their son will become a high priest, and then when he dies, the next son will become a high priest. Right? So this system was given to them by the law. But this system of priesthood could not make the people of Israel perfect. It could not make them spiritually perfect. So because of this, the law had to be changed. And if the law is changed, the law of Moses had to be changed. So that again links back to the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. So the Old Covenant had to be changed. But if you're changing the covenant, if the law of Moses has to be changed, then the system of priests also has to be changed because they're both connected. So here the author introduces the character of Jesus, and he says because the law has to be changed, because the old law could not make anyone perfect, God had to change the law into a new law. And when he changed the law, he also had to change the priest. And this is where he talks about Jesus, and he says that Jesus is the new priest under the new covenant who makes his people perfect. And then the author explains that just like Melchizedek, Jesus is not from the tribe of Levi, he's from the tribe of Judah. And there is nothing in the law of Moses that says that a high priest will come from the tribe of Judah. The law of Moses only tells the people that a high priest will come from the tribe of Levi. So Jesus does not follow the law of Moses when it comes to his priesthood. But then the author makes the connection back in the second half of the chapter, where he says that even though Jesus is not like the Levitical priest, he's more like Melchizedek, in the sense that he's not from the tribe of Levi, just like Melchizedek is not from the tribe of Levi. And then he goes on to make another connection to an Old Testament prophecy about the coming Messiah in Psalms 110:4, where God says, "You will be a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." So every Jewish believer knew that the coming Messiah would be a high priest like Melchizedek. Not like Aaron, but a high priest like Melchizedek. And what that means is that his priesthood will have no end. Because Aaron's priesthood ends when he dies, but Jesus' priesthood never ends. The coming Messiah's priesthood never ends. And this is what the prophecy means. So the author explains here that Jesus matches up to this description through many different ways. And there are three things that he says. He says that first of all, Jesus did not become a priest according to human rules and laws. That is, he did not become a priest according to the law of Moses. Secondly, he says that he became a priest by the power of his life. That is, he's a priest forever because he overcame death and he rose again, and he lives forever. Thirdly, he says that he became a priest by oath, which means that God already made a promise that the coming Messiah will be a high priest like Melchizedek, and Jesus came to fulfill that promise. So the author now says that the old law, the law of Moses, is weak and useless because it could not make anyone perfect. And because of this, God changed that law to bring a new law under which Jesus is our high priest. And the author explains that Jesus is the guarantee of the new covenant that God had promised his people. So God said, "I will make a new covenant with my people," and the proof that God did bring that new covenant is found in Jesus Christ. Finally, the author concludes this chapter by saying that Jesus' priesthood is better than the priesthood of Melchizedek, mainly because in the law of Moses, no one could become spiritually perfect. But in the new covenant, anyone who comes to Jesus Christ and believes in him and accepts him as their high priest is made perfect before God, and they're made right with God. And Jesus is able to make anyone who comes to him through faith perfect before God. And just like the other comparisons that the author makes in the book of Hebrews, so he says Jesus is better than angels because Jesus is the Son. Jesus is better than Moses because Jesus is the Son. And here we see that Jesus is better than priests. And although he gives many reasons for why he's better than Levitical priests, he concludes the chapter by saying that because Jesus is the Son of God and because he lives forever, he can understand our weakness, And even though he became human, he did not sin, and his priesthood never ends because his life never ends. Because of these reasons, and mainly because he's the Son of God, Jesus is a better high priest than the Levitical priests. So from here on, in the next chapter, the author explains the need for a new covenant, why God had to make a new covenant, and how that changed things compared to how things were followed during the time of the law of Moses. But we look at that in the next episode. I hope you found that episode useful. If you have any questions, then please send them to this email address given below. Subscribe to our channel, Church of the Living God, and I hope to see you again in the next episode. Bye.